The world is not equal. That was the fundamental truth Izuku Midoriya learned at the tender age of 4. Most children learn this through the harsh realities of scrapped knees, stolen toys, or the sudden realization that they could not fly, no matter how hard they flapped their arms. Izuku, however, learned it through a doctor's sterile, detached diagnosis and an X-ray of a foot lacking a very specific, evolutionary joint, quirkless. It was a label that, in the dawn of the superhuman society, translated roughly to obsolete. He was a rotary phone in an era of quantum computing, a pawn on a chessboard where everyone else was a knight, a rook, or a queen. But Izuku did not cry for long. Tears were an inefficient use of hydration, and despair was an illogical response to a static variable. By the age of 7, Izuku had wiped his eyes, picked up a pen, and looked at the world not with awe, but with a dissecting, hyper-analytical gaze. If he was a pawn, then he simply had to understand the board better than the players themselves. The human brain is a remarkable engine. Without a quirk to rely on, Izuku's brain compensated. It rewired itself, developing an almost terrifying capacity for pattern recognition, spatial awareness, and predictive modeling. He didn't just watch heroes on television, he broke them down. He calculated velocity, impact thresholds, aerodynamic drag, and collateral damage matrices. He studied psychology, physics, anatomy, and metallurgy. He mapped out the cascading consequences of every action a hero, or a villain, took in a public space. To the rest of the world, he was just plain, quirkless, defenseless Deku. To himself, he was the Grand Master of a game no one else even knew they were playing. The scratching of chalk against the blackboard echoed through the classroom at Aldera Junior High. Outside, the cherry blossoms were in full bloom, signaling the end of the academic year, but inside, the air was thick with the restless energy of teenagers eager to unleash their superhuman abilities upon the world. So, as third-year students, it's time to start thinking seriously about your futures, the homeroom teacher announced, holding a thick stack of career aptitude papers. He paused, a smirk tugging at his lips. But who am I kidding? You're all aiming for the hero course, aren't you? He tossed the papers into the air. The classroom erupted. A cacophony of quirks activated in unison, elongated fingers, localized fire bursts, minor telekinesis, and sonic shouts. Izuku sat in the back row, his face impassive. He didn't cheer. He didn't flinch. His eyes simply darted across the room, registering data at a blistering pace. Takahashi, minor pyrokinesis. Max output, 400 degrees Celsius. Burnout rate, 4 seconds. Useless in a prolonged engagement. Morita, elasticity. Coefficient of restitution is poor. If stretched beyond 3 meters, muscle fibers will tear. His gaze settled on the desk in front of him. His notebook, labeled Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13, lay open. The pages were not filled with the childish doodles of a fanba, but with complex schematics, behavioral algorithms, and physics equations. He was currently mapping out the structural weaknesses of MT Lady's gigantification quirk. Square cube law dictates that her bone density must increase exponentially to support her mass, meaning her joints are vulnerable to localized sonic disruptions. Hey, teach! A loud, arrogant voice cut through the noise, silencing the room instantly. Don't lump me in with these bunch of losers. I'm not gonna be stuck at the bottom with the rest of these rejects. Katsuki Bakugo leaned back in his chair, his feet propped up on his desk. The room bristled with indignation, but no one dared challenge him. Izuku didn't look up from his notebook. He didn't need to. He already knew exactly what Katsuki was doing, posturing. Angle of the shoulders tilted back at 15 degrees, displaying dominance. Heart rate elevated, indicated by the slight flush in his neck. Sweat glands in his palms are currently secreting a nitroglycerin-like compound. He's itching for a physical confrontation to validate his own perceived superiority. Ah, Bakugo. You're aiming for UA high, aren't you? The teacher noted, adjusting his glasses. The class gasped. UA was the national standard, a fortress of heroism with an acceptance rate of less than 2%. That's right. Katsuki barked, leaping onto his desk. I aced the mock test. I'm the only one at this school who could possibly get in. I'm gonna surpass All Might and become the top hero. My name will be inscribed on the list of top earners. Oh, Midoriya, you're going for UA2, right? The teacher's offhand comment was like dropping a match into a powder keg. The room froze. Then, a collective roar of laughter shook the windows. Midoriya? No way! You can't get into the hero course just by studying. He's quirkless. What's he gonna do, calculate the villain to death? Izuku continued to write, his pen gliding smoothly over the paper. Equation 4. If empty lady's mass increases to 20,000 kilograms, the pressure on asphalt per square inch would cause a subterranean collapse over any municipal sewer line. Slam! An explosion rocked Izuku's desk, scorching the wood and sending a plume of acrid smoke into his face. Izuku didn't flinch. He merely blinked through the smoke, his eyes tracking the trajectory of Katsuki's hand as it snatched his notebook. Listen up, Deku, Katsuki snarled, his red eyes blazing with barely contained fury. You're worse than the rest of these damn rejects. You're completely quirkless. You really think you can rub shoulders with me? Izuku looked at Katsuki. Really looked at him. He didn't see a terrifying bully. He saw a walking thermodynamic anomaly. He saw a boy whose entire self-worth was intrinsically tied to the explosive yield of his sweat glands. Katsuki was predictable. Every movement, every word, was a calculated attempt to maintain a hierarchy that Izuku fundamentally didn't care about. Give it back, Katsuki, Izuku said. His voice was calm, devoid of the tremor that used to plague him when they were younger. It wasn't bravery. It was a lack of emotional investment. Fear was an illogical variable. Katsuki's eye twitched. That calmness. That empty, calculating stare. It infuriated him more than any insult could. Deku was supposed to cower. Deku was supposed to tremble. Instead, Deku looked at him like he was a math problem to be solved. We don't know what you're writing in this creepy little stalker diary, Katsuki growled, placing a glowing palm flat against the notebook. Izuku's eyes widened a fraction. Wait. The moisture in the air today is 62%. The paper is standard 80 GSM. If he detonates at close range, boom. The notebook was engulfed in a small explosion, its edges instantly charring as Katsuki tossed it out the open window. It plummeted into the koi pond below. Most top-string heroes have stories about them from their middle school days, Katsuki said, leaning in close, his breath smelling faintly of caramelized sugar and burned ozone. I want the shine of being the only student from this mediocre middle school to make it into UA. I'm a perfectionist. So don't even think about applying, you damn nerd. Katsuki turned away, his two lackeys snickering behind him. If you want to be a hero so bad, there's a quick way to do it. Believe that you'll be born with a quirk in your next life, and take a swan dive off the roof. Izuku stood frozen. Not from the cruelty of the words, but because his mind had instantly visualized the physics of Katsuki's suggestion. A drop from the 4-story roof. Terminal velocity achieved in roughly 1.5 seconds. The impact force on the concrete below would shatter his skull and sever his spinal cord instantly. A messy, inefficient end. More importantly, it would be a strategic failure. Giving up was tantamount to flipping the chess board just because you lost a pawn. Izuku quietly packed his bag and left the room. The koi pond was murky, and the notebook was currently serving as a makeshift lily pad for a very confused fish. Izuku retrieved it, gently brushing the algae off the scorched cover. The heat from the explosion cauterized the edges of the paper, preventing total water saturation, Izuku noted mentally, shaking the damp book. Katsuki's quirk relies on nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin is highly volatile, but it requires an ignition source. If I were to neutralize the pH balance of his sweat, or lower the ambient temperature around his palms to below freezing, his quirk would be rendered entirely inert. A simple localized nitrogen burst would do it. He sighed, tucking the ruined notebook under his arm. Strategies to defeat Katsuki Bakugo filled an entire volume of his notes. But beating Bakugo wasn't the goal. The goal was heroism. Izuku walked home through the bustling streets of Mizurufu. The city was a living, breathing ecosystem of quirks. He watched a man with elongated legs stride over a traffic jam. He saw a woman casually levitating her groceries. Every quirk had a rule. Every rule had a loophole. He approached a dark underpass. The shadows were thick here, the hum of the city fading into a dull roar. Clink. Squish. Izuku paused. His ears, trained to pick up auditory anomalies, registered the sound instantly. It wasn't water dripping. It was viscous, thick, and moving with a deliberate, unnatural rhythm. He calculated the distance to the exit. 20 meters. Average walking speed is 1.4 meters per second. Running speed, factoring in his backpack weight, would be roughly 6 meters per second. He could be out in just over 3 seconds. He didn't make it to 1. From the manhole cover behind him, a geyser of foul-smelling sludge erupted. It smelled of rotting eggs, methane, and decaying organic matter. Izuku whipped around, his eyes instantly scanning the mass. Amorphous solid? No, non-Newtonian fluid. It responds to stress by thickening. The coloration suggests high concentrations of raw sewage and industrial runoff. A medium-sized meat suit. A garbled, watery voice gurgled from the mass. 2 massive, bulbous eyes formed from the sludge, locking onto Izuku. Perfect to hide in. Before Izuku could move, a tendril of sludge whipped forward, wrapping around his legs and yanking him off his feet. He hit the concrete hard. Instantly, the sludge surged over his body, enveloping his chest, his arms, and rushing toward his face. Don't worry, the villain purred, forcing the sludge into Izuku's mouth and nose. It'll only hurt for about 45 seconds. You'll feel better soon. Izuku couldn't breathe. The sludge was thick, coating his throat like liquid concrete. Panic, a primal human instinct, flared in his chest, but his analytical mind violently suppressed it. Panic consumed oxygen. Oxygen was now a finite resource. Time until unconsciousness, approximately 40 seconds. Time until irreversible brain damage, 3 minutes. The fluid is filling my trachea. I cannot ingest it. The toxicity will cause immediate pulmonary edema. He clawed at the sludge, his fingers slipping uselessly through the viscous material. He couldn't grab it. You can't punch water. I need a fulcrum. A solid point of leverage. His eyes frantically searched the fluid mass. The only solid matter within the villain's physiology were the 2 large eyeballs and a set of jagged teeth. Izuku's left hand, free from the thickest part of the binding, snapped upward. He didn't aim for the villain's body. He aimed his thumb, rigidly extended, directly into the center of the villain's right eye. Gah! The sludge villain shrieked, recoiling instinctively. The pressure around Izuku's face loosened for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Izuku gasped, inhaling a lungful of precious air, before the sludge violently slammed back into place, thicker and tighter this time. You little brat! I'll snap your neck! The villain roared. Izuku's vision began to spot with black. He had played his only card. He had analyzed the weakness, executed a strike, and failed due to a lack of physical strength. Variable, insufficient force. It was a mathematical certainty now. He was going to die in this tunnel. Then, a localized change in air pressure made Izuku's eardrums pop. The manhole cover clattered to the ground, blown off its hinges. A massive silhouette blocked the light from the tunnel's entrance. Fear not, kid! A booming voice echoed, shaking the dust from the concrete ceiling. I am here. Even through the hypoxic haze, Izuku recognized the silhouette. The 2 tufts of blonde hair. The sheer, impossible muscle mass. All Might. The symbol of peace. All Might? The villain screamed, the sludge vibrating with terror. A massive tendril of fluid lashed out toward the hero. Izuku's brain, starving for oxygen, still managed to calculate the incoming strike. The villain is extending his mass, thinning his core density. If All Might strikes now, the kinetic energy will disperse through the fluid, blowing it apart like a water balloon. All Might pulled back his fist. The air around him seemed to warp, bending under the sheer immense pressure of his muscular contraction. Texas! All Might roared, lunging forward with a speed that defied the laws of physics. Smash! The punch didn't even connect with the villain. It didn't need to. The sheer concussive force of the air pressure generated by the strike hit the sludge like a solid wall of titanium. Izuku felt the wind shear rip the fluid from his lungs, peeling the villain off him at a molecular level. The wind pressure was so intense it created a localized vacuum, blasting the sludge into microscopic droplets that splattered against the tunnel walls. Izuku hit the ground, coughing violently, dragging ragged breaths into his burning lungs. He looked up, his vision blurry, to see All Might standing over him, quickly sweeping the dispersed sludge into 2 large plastic soda bottles. He contained the fluid before it could coalesce, Izuku noted, his brain rebooting. Brilliant. Simple, but highly efficient. Thought I lost him in the sewers. All Might boomed, capping the bottles tightly. But thanks to you buying a few seconds, I caught up. Good job, citizen, Izuku stared. It was him. The man he had analyzed in 1,000 notebooks. The apex of heroic achievement. All Might turned, tapping the bottles into his massive cargo pockets. Well, I must be off. These villains won't deliver themselves to the police. Wait. Izuku's mind flashed. He's leaving? But I have 143 questions regarding his aerodynamic drag during a Detroit smash. I need to know the exact tensile limit of his muscle fibers. As All Might bent his knees, preparing to leap, Izuku didn't think. For the first time in his life, logic took a backseat to pure, unadulterated desperation. He lunged, grabbing a fistful of All Might's trousers just as the hero launched himself into the stratosphere. The acceleration was instantaneous. The G-force pressed against Izuku's face, pulling his cheeks back as the city shrank beneath them. Hey, hey, hey! All Might shouted, looking down in shock. Let go! Your fanaticism is a bit much. If I let go now, I'll fall to my death. Izuku screamed over the roaring wind, his knuckles white. Current altitude, approximately 400 meters. Wind speed, 120 kilometers per hour. Terminal velocity from this height guarantees a fatality rate of 100%. Oh. Right, All Might realized. Hold on. I'll find a place to land. They touched down on the roof of a 3-story commercial building. Izuku collapsed onto his hands and knees, hyperventilating as his inner ear desperately tried to recalibrate his equilibrium. Well, that was reckless, young man. All Might said, marching toward the roof access door. But I really must be going. I'm out of time. Wait. Izuku gasped, climbing to his feet. I need to ask you something. Something important. He looked at All Might's broad back. This was it. The ultimate variable. The question that would determine the entire trajectory of his life. Can someone without a quirk be a hero like you? Izuku asked, his voice echoing across the empty rooftop. Can someone who is completely powerless still save lives? All Might stopped. He didn't turn around. For a second, the roof was dead silent. Then, a strange hissing sound filled the air. Steam began to pour from All Might's body, his massive frame shuddering violently. Izuku blinked. Smoke? No, steam. Rapid cellular degeneration? A sudden drop in body mass? Before his eyes, the towering symbol of peace deflated. The imposing, 270-kilogram titan of muscle vanished, replaced by a gaunt, skeletal man in baggy clothes. His eyes were sunken, dark shadows clinging to his cheekbones. He coughed violently, a spray of blood splattering against the concrete. What? Izuku stammered, taking a step back. You're a fake? An imposter? I assure you, I am All Might, the skeletal man sighed, wiping the blood from his chin. He slumped against the railing, looking infinitely tired. Izuku's brain, frozen for a microsecond by the sheer impossibility of the situation, suddenly kicked into overdrive. The gears ground together, locking into place, and the analysis began. The transformation isn't a quirk, it's a physiological state. Like flexing a muscle. But the degradation, he's severely underweight. Malnourished? No, his caloric intake must be massive to sustain that form. There's a severe impediment to his digestive or respiratory system. Izuku's eyes darted to the left side of All Might's torso. The shirt was slightly lifted, revealing a horrific, sprawling mass of purple and red scar tissue radiating outward like a spiderweb. That scar, the epicenter, is the lower left quadrant of the abdomen. The respiratory distress. The blood coughing. You're missing your stomach, Izuku blurted out, his voice dropping to a clinical whisper. And likely a significant portion of your respiratory organs. Your left lung is compromised. That's why you have a time limit. All Might froze. His sunken blue eyes locked onto Izuku, widening in genuine shock. How did you know that? The blood, Izuku pointed to the concrete. It's oxygen-deprived, dark red, indicating a pulmonary issue. Your posture is slumped to the left, favoring the side with the missing mass. 5 years ago, there was a massive disruption in your public appearances. The media blamed it on your agency expanding to America, but the timeline matches a critical injury. Toxic chainsaw? No, All Might breathed, staring at this green-haired teenager as if he were looking at an alien. That punk couldn't scratch me. This was someone else. I kept it hidden from the public. A symbol of peace cannot be seen bleeding. All Might sighed, looking out over the city. My limit for hero work is about 3 hours a day now. The rest of the time, I'm this. A hollowed-out ghost. Izuku absorbed this information. It shifted every paradigm he had ever constructed. The symbol of peace was mortal. He was dying. To answer your question, kid, All Might said, his voice dropping an octave, heavy with reality. Heroes are always putting their lives on the line. Some villains can't be beaten with just a brave heart. You need power. You need a quirk. The words hit Izuku like physical blows, but he didn't cry. If you want to save people, become a police officer, All Might continued, turning toward the door. They get mocked for receiving villains on a silver platter, but it's a fine profession. It's not bad to dream, young man. But you have to ensure your dreams are attainable. You have to look at reality. The roof door clicked shut. All Might was gone. Izuku stood alone on the roof. The wind whipped his messy green hair. Look at reality. He closed his eyes. Most people, hearing their ultimate idol shatter their dreams, would break. They would cry, scream, and surrender to the despair of their inadequacy. Izuku's mind simply opened a new folder. Hypothesis rejected. Frontline brawler heroism is mathematically impossible without a physical enhancement quirk. Initiating secondary protocols. Tactical command. Underground heroics via support gear. Information brokering for pro-hero agencies. He was quirkless, not brainless. If he couldn't be the knight charging into battle, he would be the hand that moved the knight. He would be the Grandmaster. Izuku opened his eyes. They were cold, focused, and terrifyingly clear. He picked up his ruined notebook and walked toward the stairs. The smell of smoke hit his nostrils 3 blocks away. Izuku paused. Chemical fire. High sulfur content. Smells like burning plastic and ozone. He altered his route, following the plume of black smoke rising above the Tatooine shopping district. A massive crowd had gathered, held back by a thin line of police tape. Izuku slipped through the throngs of onlookers, slipping to the front. The scene was a disaster. The sludge villain, the exact same one All Might had bottled, was currently a towering mass of fluid, thrashing violently in the center of the alleyway. Fires raged on the surrounding buildings, blowing out windows and dropping flaming debris onto the asphalt. How did he escape? Izuku thought, his eyes narrowing. The bottles. They must have dislodged when I grabbed All Might's leg. I introduced a variable that caused a containment failure. This is my fault. Guilt flashed in his chest, but he ruthlessly crushed it. Guilt was an emotion. Emotions clouded judgment. He needed data. He scanned the perimeter. Death Arms, Kamui Woods, Empty Lady, and Backdraft were on the scene. It's no good. Death Arms shouted, punching a piece of falling debris. I can't get a grip on him. He's just liquid. My wood will catch fire instantly in this heat. Kamui Woods yelled, retreating from a burst of flame. I need a 2-lane street to activate my quirk without crushing these buildings. Empty Lady groaned, shielding her face. Izuku's brain mapped the battlefield in a 3-dimensional grid. Battlefield parameters, narrow alleyway, approximately 4 meters across. High thermal output from surrounding structural fires. Pro-hero composition, close combat specialist, useless against fluid. Flammable restraint specialist, useless in fire. Gigantification specialist, useless in confined spaces. Hydration specialist, currently preoccupied with fire mitigation. Conclusion: the pro-heroes are currently trapped in a tactical deadlock. They are relying on their quirk's primary functions and failing to adapt to the environmental variables. Izuku looked at the sludge villain. The fluid mass was violently churning, but something was wrong. The villain wasn't just rampaging. He was trying to restrain something inside him. Explosions, muffled concussive blasts were detonating from within the sludge. Every few seconds, a flash of orange light illuminated the dark fluid. Nitroglycerin. Izuku's breath hitched. Katsuki? He focused on the epicenter of the sludge. Katsuki's face was barely visible, contorted in agony, struggling for air. He was firing his explosions rapidly, desperately trying to blow the villain apart. Izuku's analytical engine spiked to 100%. He processed the scene not as a tragedy, but as a complex chemical and physical equation. Katsuki is firing explosions at a rate of roughly 1 every 2 seconds. Explosions require oxygen to combust. The alleyway is already consumed by secondary fires, which are rapidly depleting the ambient oxygen. Izuku looked at the flames climbing the walls. They were leaning inward, drawn toward the center of the alley. He's creating a backdraft. Katsuki's explosions were sucking the remaining oxygen out of the localized atmosphere. By fighting back, Katsuki was actively asphyxiating himself and feeding the surrounding fires. The sludge villain, lacking lungs, was entirely unaffected by the oxygen depletion. He's got a hostage. Death Arms grunted. We have to wait for someone with a suitable quirk. Wait! Izuku's mind screamed. In 45 seconds, the ambient oxygen level will drop below 15%. In 60 seconds, Katsuki will lose consciousness. In 90 seconds, irreversible brain damage begins. Waiting is a mathematical guarantee of death. The heroes were doing the math wrong. They were waiting for a savior when they needed a strategist. Before his conscious mind could even register the decision, Izuku's body moved. He ducked under the police tape. Hey! Kid, get back here! Death Arms roared, reaching out, but Izuku was already gone. He didn't run wildly. He sprinted with terrifying precision, his eyes darting across the debris field. Variable 1, the fires. He adjusted his trajectory, stepping precisely between 2 burning fallen signs, using the thermal updraft to predict the wind direction. Variable 2, the villain's fluid dynamics. Izuku remembered the tunnel. The sludge was thickest near its core, but it thinned out when stretched. The only solid anchor points were the eyes and teeth. You again? The sludge villain roared, recognizing the green-haired boy charging at him. I'll kill you both! A massive tendril of sludge whipped forward, aiming to take Izuku's head off. Izuku didn't dodge. He calculated the velocity of the whip and slid into a baseball slide on the scorched asphalt, feeling the heat singe his uniform as the tendril sliced through the air mere inches above his nose. He popped back up to his feet, now within 3 meters of the villain. Katsuki is submerged, but the villain's mouth is open, taunting. I cannot pull Katsuki out. The suction force coefficient of the non-Newtonian fluid combined with friction would dislocate Katsuki's shoulders before he came free. Izuku reached into his memory of the tunnel. I need a wedge. A disruption in the fluid's surface tension. He unshouldered his heavy, yellow backpack. It was filled with thick textbooks, lead pencils, and a reinforced steel water bottle. It weighed exactly 8.4 kilograms. He gripped the strap, spinning on his heel to generate centrifugal force. He calculated the rotational inertia, the wind resistance, and the exact trajectory needed. He released the bag. It flew like a cannonball. The heavy steel water bottle inside collided dead center with the sludge villain's right eyeball. Gah! The villain shrieked, the intense, localized pain causing his central mass to momentarily liquefy and lose its grip. Katsuki's face breached the surface of the sludge, gasping violently for air. His red eyes widened in absolute shock as he saw Izuku standing there. Deku? Katsuki coughed, hacking up foul liquid. What the hell are you doing? You're suffocating yourself, Katsuki! Izuku yelled, his voice cutting through the roar of the flames with absolute authority. Stop firing! Your explosions are consuming the ambient oxygen and creating a localized vacuum. You are feeding the fires. Katsuki froze. His hands, glowing with heat, sputtered and died. It went against every instinct he had, but the sheer, unwavering certainty in Izuku's voice commanded obedience. Izuku didn't stop moving. He noticed a jagged piece of rusted rebar protruding from a chunk of concrete rubble near his feet. He grabbed it, ignoring the rough rust tearing at his palms. He lunged forward, driving the rebar directly into the space between Katsuki's neck and the encroaching sludge. He didn't use it to attack the villain. He used it as a lever. He braced the bottom of the rebar against a solid piece of debris on the ground, creating a wedge that physically prevented the sludge from closing back over Katsuki's mouth. "Breathe, Katsuki," Izuku ordered, his eyes locked onto the churning fluid. "I've altered the surface tension. I bought you exactly 1.4 seconds before the structural integrity of this rebar fails under his pressure." Katsuki took a massive, agonizing breath, his lungs expanding. In the crowd, hidden among the onlookers, a skeletal man watched in absolute awe. Toshinori Yagi clutched his side, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had seen pro-heroes paralyze in fear. He had seen veterans hesitate. But this quirkless boy had just processed a catastrophic battlefield, identified the structural and chemical variables, executed a flawless physical intervention, and rescued a hostage, all in less than 6 seconds. He hadn't relied on an overpowering quirk. He had used physics. He had used his mind. "He is a genius," Toshinori realized, his blood rushing. "A terrifying, beautiful genius. I'll crush you!" The sludge villain roared, reforming a massive tendril above Izuku's head. The rebar began to groan, bending under the immense pressure of the fluid mass. Izuku didn't flinch. He calculated the shadow falling over him. Impact in 0.8 seconds. Evasion impossible. Objective achieved. Hostage oxygenated. He closed his eyes, preparing for the crushing blow. It never came. A hand grabbed Izuku's shoulder, pulling him back with gentle but absolute force. "I told you," a voice boomed, rattling the fillings in Izuku's teeth. To look at reality. Izuku's eyes snapped open. All Might stood before him, fully buffed, his massive muscular form radiating an intense, overwhelming heat. Blood dripped from his mouth, a sign that he was pushing far beyond his physical limit, but his blue eyes burned with a ferocity that defied logic. "But what kind of hero would I be?" All Might roared, raising his fist, "if I didn't learn from a student?" All Might grabbed Katsuki's arm with his left hand, bypassing the suction entirely through sheer, unimaginable brute force, yanking the blonde boy free from the sludge. With his right hand, All Might drew back. The air pressure dropped instantly, the oxygen rushing toward his fist. "Detroit." Izuku immediately threw himself flat on the ground, covering his ears and opening his mouth to equalize the internal pressure. Smash! The impact was cataclysmic. A literal tornado erupted in the center of the alley. The concussive blast wave obliterated the sludge villain, scattering his liquid form across a 3-block radius. The sheer wind pressure hit the surrounding fires, starving them of oxygen instantly and extinguishing them in a massive cloud of white smoke. The clouds above the city physically parted, split by the updraft of the punch. It began to rain. The crowd was dead silent. Then, a deafening roar of cheers erupted. Izuku slowly picked himself up from the wet asphalt. He looked at the scattered drops of sludge, the extinguished fires, and the towering form of All Might, who was currently panting heavily, flashing a victory sign to the crowd. Calculated output, at least 300 times greater than the Texas Smash, Izuku noted mentally, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline drop. The localized pressure change actually triggered condensation in the atmosphere. A weather-altering physical strike. He was pulled from his thoughts by a rough hand grabbing his collar. "What the hell is wrong with you, kid?" Death Arms bellowed, his face red with fury. Kamui Woods and Empty Lady stood behind him, looking equally furious. "You could have gotten yourself killed. There was absolutely no reason for you to run into a blazing fire. You left the work to the professionals." Izuku looked at the 3 pro-heroes. He looked at Katsuki, who was sitting on the ground, being treated by paramedics, staring at Izuku with a complex mix of rage and utter confusion. Izuku sighed. He didn't want to do this, but correcting flawed data was a compulsion he couldn't ignore. "With all due respect, sir," Izuku said, his voice flat and perfectly level. "Your methodology was fundamentally flawed." Death Arms blinked, stunned by the absolute lack of fear in the boy's eyes. "Excuse me? You assumed the hostage was in immediate danger of being crushed," Izuku explained, pointing to the alley. "He wasn't. The fluid operates as a non-Newtonian mass. it dispersed the kinetic energy of his explosions. The real danger was hypoxia. The hostage's explosions were creating a backdraft, sucking the oxygen out of the alley. If I had waited for a suitable quirk, as you suggested, the hostage would have suffered irreversible brain damage in exactly 30 seconds. The pro-heroes stared at him, their mouths slightly open. Furthermore, Izuku turned to NT Lady. You stated you couldn't enter because of the confined space. However, if you had gigantified directly at the mouth of the alley and laid prone, your body mass would have acted as a perfect windbreak, starving the secondary structural fires of oxygen and preventing the backdraft entirely. MT Lady's jaw practically hit the floor. And you, Izuku looked at Kamui Woods. Your wood is flammable, yes. But carbonized wood is highly resistant to heat. If you had intentionally ignited the outer layer of your branches, you could have created a carbon snare to pull the hostage free without burning yourself. Kamui Woods stepped back, looking at his wooden hands as if seeing them for the first time. You all possess the tools to resolve the situation, Izuku finished, picking up his ruined backpack. You simply lack the strategic vision to apply them outside of their primary parameters. A quirk is just a tool. It's only as effective as the mind wielding it. Good day. Izuku bowed respectfully, turned, and walked away. He left 3 top-tier pro-heroes standing in the rain, utterly humiliated and completely speechless, dismantled by a middle schooler with a charred notebook. The walk home was quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflecting the neon lights of the city. Izuku's mind was racing. The events of the day had solidified his resolve. He didn't need to be All Might. He could be the tactical architect that commanded 10 All Mights. He just needed to figure out how to bypass the UA entrance exam's physical requirements. Perhaps a loophole in the support equipment regulations. I am here. Izuku stopped. All Might slid out from a side alley, his massive muscular form striking a dramatic pose, blocking the sidewalk. All Might? Izuku asked, calculating the distance between the alley and the incident site. He outpaced me by a significant margin. His speed is still exceptional despite his respiratory limits. Ha! I escaped the press to find. All Might suddenly deflated with a wet cough, returning to his skeletal form, wiping a trail of blood from his mouth. To find you, young man? Izuku tilted his head. Are you seeking a medical consultation? Because I can recommend several specialists in organ regeneration. No, Toshinori chuckled, holding up a hand. He leaned against the street lamp, looking at Izuku with an intensity that made the boy pause. I came to apologize. And to correct a mistake. Izuku remained silent, waiting for the data to be presented. On that roof, I told you to look at reality, Toshinori said softly. I told you that you couldn't be a hero without a quirk. I was speaking from a place of fear. I have held the greatest power in the world for decades, and yet, when I saw that villain today, I hesitated. Toshinori took a step forward, his blue eyes piercing through the gloom. Those pro-heroes hesitated. The police hesitated. The entire city stopped and waited for someone else to act, Toshinori said. But you didn't have an ounce of power. You didn't have a flashy quirk or superhuman strength. But you saw the board. You saw the pieces. And you moved. Izuku's breath hitched slightly. The metaphor resonated deeply within his analytical mind. I heard what you told Death Arms and the others. Toshinori smiled, a genuine, warm expression. You didn't just save that boy. You mathematically deconstructed a disaster zone in seconds. You possess an intellect that transcends quirks, young Midoriya. Toshinori stood up straight, his skeletal frame suddenly possessing a gravity, a majesty that rivaled his muscular form. Top heroes have stories about them from their school days, Toshinori said, echoing Katsuki's words, but stripping them of all malice. Most of their stories have one thing in common. Their bodies moved before they had a chance to think. Izuku's eyes widened. That was exactly what had happened. For all his calculations, his legs had moved on their own. You possess the heart of a true hero, and the mind of a visionary, Toshinori declared, pointing a long, bony finger at Izuku. You can become a hero. Izuku closed his eyes. He didn't cry. Crying was inefficient. But a profound, heavy weight lifted from his chest. The greatest variable in the world had just validated his existence. Thank you, Izuku said quietly, respectfully. I will be the greatest tactical commander the hero world has ever seen. Tactical commander? Toshinori blinked, lowering his hand. Well, yes, I suppose. But that's not exactly what I had in mind. Izuku opened his eyes, confused. What do you mean? Toshinori smirked, stepping closer. I told you earlier that my quirk wasn't natural strength. It's a sacred torch, passed down from generation to generation. A crystallization of power. Izuku's analytical mind froze. Passed down? Quirk transference? That violates the fundamental laws of quirk genetics. Unless the quirk itself possesses a biological override mechanism capable of altering the host's DNA. It is called one for all, Toshinori said, his voice reverent. I am the eighth holder of this power. And I have been searching for a successor. Izuku stared at him. The calculations in his head were spinning out of control. He wants to give me his quirk. The sheer kinetic energy output of one for all. If applied to my physical frame without proper reinforcement, my limbs would detonate like overpressurized blood balloons. You have the mind of a grandmaster, young Midoriya, Toshinori said, placing a heavy hand on Izuku's shoulder. But even a grandmaster cannot win a war without pieces. I want to give you the ultimate piece. I want to give you the queen. Izuku looked down at his hands. He imagined it. He imagined possessing the raw, unadulterated power of All Might, combined with his own flawless ability to predict, analyze, and manipulate the battlefield. It wouldn't just make him a hero. It would make him a god of the chessboard. Izuku looked up, his green eyes locking onto Toshinori's blue ones. There was no fear, no hesitation, and no fanboy awe. There was only absolute, terrifying focus. I accept your offer, Izuku said coldly, a small, dangerous smile touching his lips. But on one condition. Toshinori blinked, taken aback. A condition? I will not use this power like you do, All Might, Izuku said, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent a chill down the symbol of peace's spine. You rely on overwhelming force to solve problems. It's inefficient, and it destroys your body. I will take your quirk. But I will break it down. I will optimize it. I will use it to control every single variable on the battlefield. Izuku extended his hand. I will not just be the symbol of peace, Izuku Midoriya promised. I will be the architect of their defeat. Toshinori Yagi looked at the boy. For a fleeting second, he wondered if he had just made a terrible mistake, or if he had just secured the future of the world. He reached out and shook Izuku's hand. Then let the training begin, Toshinori said. The game was set. The pieces were on the board. And Izuku Midoriya was finally ready to play. The scent of salt and decay hung heavily over Dagoba Municipal Beach Park. It wasn't a beach so much as it was an illegal landfill, a monument to society's over-reliance on convenience, and a tragic metaphor for how humanity treated things it deemed broken. Mountains of rusted refrigerators, crushed cars, and discarded appliances stretched across the sand, blocking out the ocean view entirely. Toshinori Yagi, in his skeletal, sunken-eyed form, stood at the edge of the paved promenade, looking out over the sea of trash. Beside him stood a 14-year-old boy holding a clipboard, a mechanical pencil, and a laser rangefinder. The vessel must be forged, Toshinori said, his voice carrying the dramatic weight of his all-might persona, even if his body lacked the muscle. One for all is the crystallized physical strength of 8 generations of heroes. If I gave it to an unprepared body, the raw kinetic energy would rip your limbs from their sockets. You'd explode like a firecracker. A gross simplification, but biologically accurate, Izuku murmured, raising the rangefinder to his eye. He clicked the button. A red dot appeared on the side of a rusted pickup truck 50 meters away. Beep. The sudden influx of a massive kinetic multiplier would cause immediate cellular rupture. The tensile strength of my current muscle fibers and osteal density is insufficient. I agree. A conditioning regimen is required. Exactly. Toshinori grinned, coughing slightly into his hand. So, young Midoriya, your task for the next 10 months is to clean this beach. By moving this trash with your own 2 hands, you will tear your muscle fibers and rebuild them, creating a vessel capable of housing my power. Toshinori gestured grandly toward a rusted washing machine half buried in the sand. Now let us begin. Lift that machine, young man. Feel the burn of heroism. Izuku didn't move. He lowered the rangefinder, jotted a number down on his clipboard, and then looked at Toshinori with an expression of polite, clinical disbelief. Are you serious? Izuku asked. Toshinori blinked. Of course I am. Hard work is only valuable when applied efficiently, Izuku interrupted seamlessly. He flipped the page on his clipboard, revealing a meticulously drawn architectural schematic of the beach. Lifting a 200-pound washing machine by hand is an inefficient use of caloric energy and introduces a 74% probability of a lumbar disc herniation, given my current unconditioned core strength. Furthermore, simply carrying the trash to the dumpsters up the stairs would take an estimated 14.6 months. The UA entrance exam is in exactly 10. Toshinori stared at the boy. But the sweat, the grit. We have physics, All Might, Izuku said softly, walking past the skeletal hero and down the stairs onto the sand. Over the next 4 hours, Toshinori sat on a concrete wall and watched in absolute, mind-numbing bewilderment as Izuku Midoriya did not lift a single heavy object. Instead, Izuku gathered ropes, discarded steel cables, and steel pipes from the perimeter. He found a massive, deeply anchored concrete piling near the waterline and tied a complex array of knots around it. He then constructed a block and tackle system, a series of makeshift pulleys, using rusted car wheel rims that he had meticulously oiled with discarded motor grease. A single pulley merely changes the direction of the force, Izuku explained aloud, as much to himself as to Toshinori, as he threaded the heavy cable. But a block and tackle with 4 wheels gives me a mechanical advantage of 4-to-1. That means to move a 400-pound refrigerator, I only need to apply 100 pounds of force. Still a workout, but a manageable one. Izuku secured the hook to a massive pile of compressed scrap metal. He took the other end of the rope, wrapped it around his waist and shoulders to distribute the pressure safely across his body, and began to walk. The muscles in Izuku's back and legs strained. Sweat beaded on his forehead. But the massive pile of metal, weighing nearly half a ton, began to drag smoothly across the sand. Toshinori's jaw dropped. Furthermore, Izuku panted slightly, pulling the trash toward a centralized sorting zone he had designated. I've checked the lunar tables. High tide peaks at exactly 1400 hours today. Salt water is denser than fresh water, providing greater buoyancy. By dragging the heavier objects, like the automobiles, into the surf zone at low tide and attaching empty, sealed plastic barrels to them, the rising tide will lift them out of the wet sand. The ocean will do 60% of the lifting for us, completely eliminating the friction coefficient of the sand. Toshinori rubbed his eyes. He had been prepared to train a successor. He had not been prepared to fund a civil engineer. Over the next 10 months, the beach transformed, and so did Izuku. But his transformation was not a montage of mindless grunting. It was a perfectly calculated biochemical equation. Izuku calculated his basal metabolic rate. He manipulated his macronutrient intake, precisely balancing protein for muscle synthesis, complex carbohydrates for sustained ADP production, and fats for hormonal regulation. He didn't just build muscle, he built highly dense, perfectly optimized fast-twitch muscle fibers. He treated sleep not as a luxury, but as an 8-hour mandatory cellular regeneration cycle. When Toshinori visited, he found Izuku using complex levers to flip pickup trucks, using the principle of fulcrums to launch heavy debris into perfectly organized piles. The boy was a machine of logic. By the end of the 9th month, the beach was utterly spotless. Golden sand sparkled under the morning sun, kissed by pristine waves. Toshinori stood on the promenade, the sea breeze blowing past him. He looked down at the beach, then at the boy standing beside him. Izuku had grown. He wasn't massive, he hadn't built bulky, restrictive bodybuilder muscle. He looked like a swimmer, or a gymnast. Lean, hyperdefined, and coiled like a steel spring. But it wasn't his physique that commanded attention, it was his eyes. They were cold, calculating, and missing the frantic, nervous energy of the boy Toshinori had met under the overpass. You finished a month early, Toshinori said, his voice thick with awe. And you didn't just clean it, you categorized the scrap metal by alloy type to sell to recycling plants, using the profits to buy high-grade nutritional supplements. Efficiency, Izuku replied simply, adjusting his wrist wraps. A hero who wastes time is a hero who lets someone die. Tashinori nodded slowly. Suddenly, the skeletal man expanded, steam erupting from his skin as he transformed into the towering, muscular symbol of peace. The dawn light caught his golden hair. You have proven yourself, young Midoriya. All Might boomed, reaching up and plucking a single golden hair from his head. He held it out between his fingers. The vessel is ready. Now eat this. Izuku stared at the hair. He looked at All Might. He looked back at the hair. Eat it, Izuku repeated flatly. To inherit my power, you must ingest some of my DNA. All Might declared proudly. Izuku pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling a long, slow breath. Right. Of course. Quirk factor transfer via genetic assimilation. I should have anticipated a biological vector. However, keratin, which hair is primarily composed of, is highly resistant to the digestive enzymes in the human stomach. It will take approximately 2 to 4 hours for the stomach acid to break down the follicular root and absorb the DNA sequence into my bloodstream. All Might faltered, his booming smile faltering. Yes? Probably? Izuku took the hair. He didn't hesitate. He popped it into his mouth and swallowed it dry. We have 3 hours until the UA entrance exam begins. Izuku checked his digital watch. The timing is suboptimal, but sufficient. Let us proceed to a secure location. I need to test the power application before the exam. Walking into a combat scenario with an untested variable is tantamount to suicide. An hour later, they stood in a secluded clearing deep within the municipal woods. The morning mist still clung to the trees. Izuku stood in the center of the clearing, his eyes closed, feeling the subtle, tectonic shifts occurring within his own biology. It was there. It felt like a dormant star had been forcefully inserted into his chest cavity. A well of sheer, unadulterated kinetic energy. All right, my boy. All Might cheered from the sidelines. The power is yours. Now, just clench your buttocks, yell smash from the bottom of your heart, and let it rip. Izuku opened his eyes. No, All Might blinked. No? What do you mean, no? That's how it works. That is how you make it work, because your body was inherently robust enough to handle the sheer force output, Izuku corrected, stepping back and assuming a relaxed, analytical posture. If I do that, if I concentrate 100% of this energy into my right arm and let it rip, the sudden surge of kinetic force will exceed the tensile limit of my humerus, radius, and ulna. The torque will rip my ligaments apart. My arm will shatter into 1,000 pieces. Oh, All Might deflated back into his skeletal form, sweating nervously. I hadn't thought of that. But it's an all-or-nothing power. Nothing is all or nothing, All Might. Energy can be regulated, Izuku said, placing a hand over his chest. Imagine a microwave. If I put an egg in a microwave and set it to 1,000 watts for 10 seconds, the water molecules inside the egg boil instantly. The pressure builds, and the egg explodes. Tashinori winced at the graphic metaphor. But Izuku continued, his eyes glowing with an intense, analytical light. If I take that same egg, and I lower the wattage to 50 watts, and I heat it slowly, the egg cooks perfectly. It doesn't break. Izuku closed his eyes again. He didn't focus on his fist. He didn't focus on screaming or clenching. He visualized the glowing core of One for All in his chest. It was a raging inferno. If I open the floodgates entirely, I break, Izuku thought. The energy needs pathways. It needs to be dispersed evenly across the entire surface area of my muscular and skeletal systems, creating an internalized pressure suit. A baseline. He didn't pull the energy. He coaxed it. He calculated his body weight, his bone density, and set a strict, mental governor, 5%. Any more will cause micro tears. 5% output. A sudden, sharp hum filled the clearing. Tashinori gasped, taking a step back. Red, glowing veins pulsed beneath Izuku's skin, spreading from his chest down to his fingertips and toes. Then, violent arcs of emerald green lightning erupted from his body, crackling and snapping in the air around him. The dry leaves on the ground were violently pushed away by a localized shockwave of pressure. Izuku opened his eyes. They were no longer just green, they were glowing with a terrifying, contained power. Fascinating, Izuku whispered. His voice layered with a faint, electrical reverb. The energy is not just strength. It is an overall physiological enhancement. My visual acuity has increased by roughly 300%. My neurological firing rate is processing the falling leaves around us as if they were moving in slow motion. Tashinori was paralyzed. It had taken him months to learn how to properly control the backlash of One for All. It had taken his predecessor, Nana Shimura, years to master the flow. Izuku Midoriya had just bypassed the entire learning curve in exactly 4 minutes through sheer deductive reasoning. All might, Izuku said, looking across the clearing at a massive, ancient oak tree. Observe. Izuku didn't wind up. He simply kicked off the ground. Boom. The earth where he had been standing cratered, dirt exploding outward. Izuku vanished. To Tashinori's eyes, he was just a blur of green lightning. In a fraction of a second, Izuku traversed the 50-meter clearing. He planted his foot on the trunk of the massive oak tree, ran horizontally up the bark for 3 steps, defying gravity entirely, pushed off, backflipped through the air, and landed perfectly on his feet exactly where he had started. The leaves from the tree, disturbed by his wake, finally began to drift down to the ground. Izuku held up his hand, flexing his fingers. Not a single bone was broken. There wasn't even a bruise. 5%, Izuku muttered, a terrifying smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The mathematical threshold of my current physical vessel. With this, the board is mine. Tashinori swallowed hard. He had given his power to a boy with a heroic heart. But looking at Izuku now, cloaked in green lightning, calculating vectors and kinetic potential in real time, Tashinori realized he had created something entirely new. He hadn't created a symbol of peace. He had created an apex predator of strategy. The towering gates of UA High School gleamed in the morning sun. Thousands of students swarmed toward the massive, H-shaped main building, the air thick with nervous chatter and the occasional spontaneous activation of a quirk. Izuku walked through the crowd in complete silence. His mind was already at work, scanning the competitors. Physical enhancement quirks are the most common here. They will dominate the center lanes of whatever practical exam is designed. Mutant types will rely on instinct over strategy. As he approached the steps, a boy with messy purple hair shoved past him, muttering under his breath. Izuku registered the bags under the boy's eyes and his poor posture. Non-physical quirk. Psychological or emitter type. He's stressed, suggesting the exam is highly physical and puts him at a disadvantage. Suddenly, Izuku's foot caught on a slightly raised paving stone. Physics dictated a forward face plant. Before he could calculate the optimal roll to disperse the kinetic impact, a hand lightly tapped his back. Instantly, the pull of gravity on Izuku's mass vanished. He floated, suspended horizontally in the air, drifting like a stray balloon. Are you okay? A bright, cheerful voice asked. Izuku rotated his head, analyzing the girl standing next to him. Round face, perpetual blush on her cheeks, pads on her fingertips. I stopped you with my quirk. She smiled, pressing her hands together. I'm sorry I didn't ask first, but I figured you wouldn't mind. It's bad luck to fall on exam day. She released the quirk. Gravity violently reasserted itself, but Izuku twisted his hips, landing perfectly on his feet with the grace of a cat. Thank you, Izuku said automatically, his eyes already dissecting her. Zero gravity. Activation vector, tactile pads on fingertips. Release vector, joining hands to complete a localized circuit. She shifted her weight uncomfortably when she released me, and there is a faint sheen of sweat on her upper lip. The quirk disrupts her own inner ear equilibrium. Nausea is the drawback. Wow, nice landing. She beamed. I'm Ochiko Uraraka. Let's do our best today. She waved and trotted off toward the auditorium. Izuku watched her go. A powerful quirk. If properly weaponized, removing the gravity of an opponent removes their ability to generate friction, rendering them completely immobile. Izuku walked into the auditorium. The game was beginning. The briefing hall was enormous, filled with thousands of aspiring heroes. Izuku sat near the front, his posture perfectly straight. Beside him, Katsuki Bakugo slouched in his chair, glaring at the stage. Katsuki hadn't spoken to Izuku since the sludge villain incident. The total dismantling of Katsuki's ego in that alleyway had left a volatile, simmering rage in the explosive boy. Welcome to today's live performance. The voice hero, Present Mike, exploded onto the stage, throwing his hands into the air. Everybody say hey. Silence. The crowd was too nervous to respond. Izuku didn't cringe at the volume. He was analyzing the acoustic properties of present mixed directional speakers. If he can focus sound waves into a physical barrier, his quirk operates on concussive frequency. Highly effective against non-Newtonian targets. As it says in the application requirements, you listeners will be conducting 10-minute mock urban battles. Present Mike shouted, an electronic map appearing on the massive screen behind him. You will be gathered in designated battle centers. 3 types of foe villains are stationed in each center. They earn you points based on their difficulty level, 1, 2, and 3 points. Izuku stared at the screen. The silhouettes of 3 robotic enemies appeared. Robots. Izuku's mind immediately began to pivot. An ethical loophole. The use of quirks on living targets is heavily regulated, so Yui bypasses this by using mechanical targets. This favors destructive quirks entirely. But wait. Izuku frowned, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. Excuse me. A tall, broad-shouldered boy with glasses and stiff blue hair stood up, pointing a rigid finger at the stage. On the printout, there are 4 types of villains. If this is a misprint, Yui, the most prominent school in Japan, should be ashamed. The boy then whipped around and pointed directly at Izuku. And you? The one with the messy hair. You haven't stopped muttering this entire time. It's distracting. If you're treating this like a game, leave immediately. Izuku looked up. He hadn't realized he was vocalizing his thoughts. The entire auditorium was staring at him. Katsuki snickered beside him. Izuku stood up. He didn't look flustered. He didn't blush. He looked at the tall boy with an expression of absolute, terrifying clarity. I apologize if my acoustic processing disturbed you, Izuku said, his voice ringing out clearly across the silent hall, devoid of any nervousness. However, I was merely analyzing the structural flaw in your complaint. The tall boy, Tenya Ida, blinked, his rigid arm faltering. Structural flaw? You are assuming a misprint. I am assuming a psychological test, Izuku said, turning his gaze back to Present Mike on the stage. A hero's school does not solely grade candidates on their capacity for destruction. If it did, it would produce soldiers, not heroes. The pamphlet explicitly shows 4 targets, but only lists 3-point values. Therefore, the 4th target is either a negative point variable, or an environmental hazard designed to force a retreat. Present Mike froze, the microphone halfway to his mouth. Behind the scenes, in the dark observation room, Principal Nizas spilled his tea. Izuku continued, the gears in his head turning so fast they almost sparked. Furthermore, if this exam truly tests the essence of heroism, there is a hidden metric. You cannot grade a hero without measuring their willingness to save others. I deduce that the 4th robot is an insurmountable obstacle, designed to put other examinees in danger, thereby triggering a hidden rescue point system for those who sacrifice their own combat time to help. The auditorium was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Tenya Ida's jaw went slack. He slowly lowered his arm, utterly dumbfounded by the sheer, irrefutable logic presented by a boy who looked no older than himself. Present Mike swallowed hard. The kid had just cracked the entire philosophy of the UA entrance exam in 30 seconds, out loud, in front of everyone. Yeah. Yes. Present Mike shouted, recovering violently. Examinee 7111 is spot on. The 4th target is a 0-pointer. It's an obstacle. A massive gimmick that goes on a rampage in narrow spaces. I recommend you listeners run away from it. Izuku sat back down, taking out a small notebook and clicking his pen. Show off, Katsuki snarled beside him, his palms popping with miniature explosions. I'm gonna crush more robots than you, Deku. Destruction is an inefficient use of time, Katsuki, Izuku replied evenly, not looking up. I'm going to own the board. Battle Center B was a breathtaking feat of engineering. It was a massive, fully constructed faux city, complete with skyscrapers, alleyways, and intersections. Hundreds of applicants stood behind the massive steel gates, stretching and psyching themselves up. Izuku stood near the back of the pack. He took a deep breath, visualizing the 5% threshold. He tightened his wrist wraps. The city is a grid, Izuku analyzed, looking at the layout visible beyond the gates. The highest concentration of targets will be deployed in the main thoroughfares to draw the most aggressive applicants. The alleyways will be secondary spawning points. The objective is maximum point accumulation in 10 minutes. Start! Present Mick's voice boomed from the hidden speakers. The crowd hesitated for a fraction of a second, waiting for a countdown. Izuku didn't. Green lightning erupted around his body. The asphalt beneath his feet spiderwebbed as he launched himself over the heads of the crowd in a massive, mathematically perfect parabolic arc. What are you waiting for? Present Mike yelled. There are no countdowns in real battles. Run! 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 The crowd surged forward, but Izuku was already a ghost. He landed softly on the roof of a 3-story building, looking down at the chaos unfolding in the streets below. Students were blasting, punching, and smashing robots left and right. Brute force, Izuku thought, shaking his head. They are exhausting themselves. The robots are heavily armored. Direct impacts require high energy expenditure. Izuku jumped down into a narrow alleyway. A 2-pointer rounded the corner, its red optics locking onto him. Target acquired, the robot droned, raising a massive steel tail equipped with a stinger. Izuku didn't power up a smash. He didn't even clench his fists. He simply observed the environment. The alleyway was damp. To his left was an exposed electrical junction box attached to the building. To his right, an old, pressurized fire hydrant. Izuku dashed forward at 5%. The robot thrust its tail stinger at him. Izuku ducked under the linear strike, his mind calculating the timing perfectly. He didn't hit the robot. He kicked the fire hydrant. With 5% one for all, the kick sheared the heavy iron bolts clean off. A massive geyser of high-pressure water erupted, flooding the alleyway instantly and dousing the robot. The 2-pointer slowed, its servos struggling against the water pressure. Izuku spun, grabbed a loose metal pipe from the ground, and hurled it with pinpoint accuracy into the electrical junction box. The box exploded in a shower of sparks. A live wire severed, dropping directly into the massive puddle of water currently engulfing the robot. Bzzzzzzzt. The water acted as a perfect conductor. The robot convulsed wildly as high-voltage electricity surged through its uninsulated chassis. The optics went dark, and the machine collapsed into a smoking heap. 2 points, Izuku noted aloud, his breathing perfectly even. Energy expended, negligible. For the next 8 minutes, the faux city became Izuku's personal physics playground. He didn't fight the robots. He orchestrated their destruction. He lured 3 1-pointers into a tight corridor, let them charge, and used 5% OFA to leap over them at the last second, causing them to crash into each other in a tangle of ruined steel. He found a 3-pointer firing kinetic missiles. Izuku calculated the trajectory of the missiles, lured the robot near a dilapidated scaffolding structure, and threw a heavy piece of debris into the missile's path right as it fired. The premature explosion took out the structural supports of the scaffolding, bringing tons of steel crashing down to crush the robot beneath it. He was a phantom. A blur of green lightning that never engaged in a slugfest, but rather moved the environment against his enemies. In the observation room, the teachers of UA sat in stunned silence. The screens showed various students showing immense promise. Katsuki Bakugo was a localized hurricane of destruction. Tenya Ida was a blur of speed, but all eyes in the room were drawn to the screen tracking examinee 7111. He's not fighting them, Midnight whispered, leaning forward, her eyes wide. He's hunting them. Look at his movements, Snipe pointed out, his voice thick with disbelief. He's not wasting a single step. He's calculating the blind spots of the robot's optics. He's using the collateral damage caused by other students to his advantage. Aizawa Shoda, the underground hero Eraserhead, sat in the back corner. His dark eyes were locked onto Izuku's screen. A chill ran down his spine. He's not a brawler, Aizawa said, his voice cutting through the dark room. He's a tactician. He realized immediately that fighting metal with flesh is a losing game. He's using the city as his weapon. He has 45 points, and he hasn't taken a single hit. Fascinating. Principal Nizu, the hyper-intelligent chimera, giggled, his paws twitching, to deduce the rescue point system verbally, and then proceed to dominate the practical exam through sheer environmental manipulation. The boy plays 4D chess while the others are playing checkers. But, let us see how our Grandmaster handles a piece that cannot be moved. Nizu slammed his paw onto a massive red button on the console. Rumble. The ground beneath Battle Center B shook violently. Izuku paused, standing atop a shattered three-pointer. Dust fell from the surrounding buildings. At the far end of the main street, the foe city was ripped apart. A towering monstrosity of steel, gears, and red optics crushed a skyscraper under its massive treads. The zero-pointer. It was larger than an aircraft carrier, casting a terrifying shadow over the entire arena. Less than 2 minutes remaining. President Mick's voice echoed. The applicants in the street shrieked in terror, turning and fleeing from the mechanical titan. 0 points, Izuku analyzed instantly. Height, approximately 150 meters. Estimated weight, over 500 tons. Armor plating, reinforced tungsten alloy. Direct physical engagement is a mathematical impossibility. It requires a strategic retreat. Izuku turned to leave. The test was over. He had enough points. Ow! The cry was faint, barely audible over the grinding gears of the Titan, but Izuku's hyper-focused auditory processing caught it instantly. He turned his head. 70 meters away, in the direct path of the zero-pointer's massive treads, Ochiko Uraraka lay pinned under a massive slab of concrete debris. The ground was shaking. The robot was bearing down on her. The other applicants were running past her, too blinded by fear to notice. Izuku didn't hesitate. The analytical engine in his brain shifted from self-preservation to rescue protocol in a millisecond. Threat assessment, zero-pointer. The target is moving forward at 15 kilometers per hour. To remove the debris and extract the victim will take roughly 8 seconds. The robot will crush her in 6. He couldn't save her in time by running to her. He had to stop the robot. But how do you stop a 500-ton Titan with a 5% physical enhancement limit? If I use 100% OFA, I will shatter my legs and arms, rendering me immobile and useless if a secondary threat arises. Unacceptable. Izuku's eyes scanned the zero-pointer. He didn't look at its menacing face or its massive fists. He looked at its base. He looked at the treads. He looked at the center of gravity. It's top-heavy, Izuku realized, his eyes widening. The designers built it to be imposing, maximizing its vertical height. But to fit in the city streets, they had to narrow its wheelbase. Its center of mass is precariously high. An object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. Izuku didn't need to push the robot backward. He just needed to trip it. Green lightning flared violently as Izuku sprinted, not toward Uraraka, but toward the side of the street. He locked onto a massive, 10-meter-long steel I-beam that had been dislodged from a destroyed building. He grabbed one end of the I-beam. Even at 5%, the weight was staggering, but he didn't need to lift it entirely. He dragged it. The zero-pointer loomed, its massive left tread grinding the asphalt into powder just 30 meters from Uraraka. Izuku dashed directly into the path of the left tread. What is he doing? Aizawa yelled in the observation room, half standing out of his chair. He's going to be crushed. Izuku planted his feet. He took the heavy steel I-beam and jammed it into a deep fissure in the broken concrete street, angling it upward at a perfect 45-degree angle, directly into the massive gears of the robot's left tread. He wasn't fighting the robot. He was building a wedge. Izuku reinforced his own stance behind the I-beam, channeling the 5% OFA entirely into his skeletal structure, acting as the ultimate anchor point for the fulcrum he had just created. The massive tread met the steel I-beam. Physics took over. The zero-pointer weighed 500 tons, moving forward with millions of pounds of kinetic energy. But that energy had to go somewhere. The impenetrable steel I-beam, anchored perfectly by the concrete and Izuku's enhanced body, did not break. It caught the rotating gear of the tread. Screech! A deafening sound of shearing metal tore through the city. The left tread violently jammed, but the robot's massive, top-heavy torso was still moving forward with immense momentum. With the left side suddenly anchored to the ground, the entire 150-meter-tall Titan pivoted violently. The center of gravity shifted past the point of no return. Timber, Izuku whispered, stepping calmly out of the way. The zero-pointer, a monument to invincible destruction, tripped over its own momentum. The massive axle snapped with a sound like a bomb going off. The Titan pitched forward, entirely out of control, and crashed into the empty city blocks away from Uraraka, obliterating dozens of buildings in a catastrophic shockwave of dust and debris. The shockwave blasted through the street. Izuku stood firm, the wind whipping his green hair, his eyes cold and analytical as he watched the dust settle over the ruined Titan. Silence fell over Battle Center B. The applicants, who had stopped running, stared in absolute, jaw-dropping horror at the destroyed zero-pointer. They hadn't seen a massive punch. They hadn't seen an explosion. They had just seen a green-haired kid jam a stick into the spokes of a god. Izuku casually walked through the settling dust toward Uraraka. He gripped the slab of concrete pinning her leg, using 5% OFA to easily lift it, and toss it aside. "Are you severely injured?" Izuku asked, his tone clinical but not unkind. "Your fibula appears intact, but there may be soft tissue damage. Do you require me to carry you to the medical station?" Uraraka stared up at him, her large brown eyes wide as saucers, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. She looked past him at the smoking crater where the zero-pointer used to be, and then back at Izuku. You, she stammered. "Time is up." President Mike screamed, his voice shaking through the speakers. Izuku sighed, releasing the green lightning. The red veins faded from his skin. He felt a mild lactic acid burn in his muscles, but his bones were perfectly intact, variables calculated. Exam completed. Outcome, highly optimal. In the observation room, absolute pandemonium had broken out. Teachers were shouting. "Did you see that?" Vlad King yelled. "He didn't use an ounce of raw power to destroy it. He used leverage. He used its own mass against it. He weaponized physics," Ectoplasm muttered, gripping his desk. Aizawa Shota stood silently in the back of the room. A wide, terrifying grin slowly spread across his usually stoic face. Heroism was plagued by idiots who thought punching harder solved every problem. Aizawa had spent his career in the underground, relying on tactics, misdirection, and logic to survive. He had never seen a student operate with such chilling, perfect rationality. The boy hadn't just passed the exam. He had made a mockery of it. Principal Nisa spun in his chair, clapping his paws together gleefully. "Oh, this year is going to be spectacular." Nisa laughed, his eyes glinting. "Eraserhead, I believe we have found your new favorite student. Examinee 7111. Izuku Midoriya." Aizawa looked at the screen, where Izuku was currently gently supporting Uraraka, helping her limp toward the entrance gates. The boy's face was completely unreadable, utterly detached from the monumental feat he had just accomplished. "He's a monster," Aizawa whispered softly, the grin never leaving his face. "I can't wait to see what he does next." The atmosphere in the ground beta locker room was thick with the scent of synthetic polymers, freshly pressed fabrics, and the nervous sweat of 15-year-olds preparing for their first real taste of combat. Izuku Midoriya stood in front of his locker, meticulously adjusting the straps of his hero costume. The original design he had sketched in his notebook years ago, a bright green jumpsuit with a red utility belt and a mask sporting rabbit-like ears to mimic All Might's hair tufts, had been thoroughly scrapped. That design was the childish fantasy of a boy who wanted to be a symbol. The boy who stood in the locker room today was not a symbol. He was a tactician. His revised costume, manufactured by the UA support company, reflected pure, ruthless utility. The base was a dark, matte forest green tactical undersuit woven from carbon nanotube fibers, highly resistant to thermal spikes and slashing attacks. Over his chest, shoulders, and knees, he wore slate gray, shock-absorbing composite plating. Instead of flashy red boots, he wore black, high-traction combat boots reinforced with steel toes and specialized grips for sudden lateral movement. Around his waist and strapped to his thighs were modular utility pouches, currently empty but designed to hold specific support gear in the future. The most prominent feature, however, was his headgear. He wore a sleek, high-collared neck guard that housed a built-in respirator and a multi-frequency communication array. Covering his eyes was a pair of tactical goggles with polarized lenses and a faint, heads-up display, HUD, that he had specifically requested. It fed him ambient temperature, humidity levels, and a localized timer. There were no capes. There were no bright colors to draw the eye. He looked like a shadow capable of doing math. "Whoa, Midoriya!" Eijiro Kirishima called out, flexing his own gear. "Your costume looks super intense. Very stealthy. Man, mine's a bit too flashy, isn't it?" Flashy is an effective tool for crowd control and drawing aggro away from vulnerable civilians, Izuku replied evenly, adjusting a wrist gauntlet. "Your quirk relies on hardening your body, making you a natural vanguard. Bright colors ensure the enemy focuses their attacks on your impenetrable defense rather than secondary targets. It is highly optimal." Kirishima blinked, stunned by the instant, clinical breakdown. Yeah? Exactly. That's totally what I was going for. So manly." Across the room, a locker door slammed shut with enough force to dent the metal. Katsuki Bakugo stood there, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might shatter. His costume was exactly as arrogant as his personality: massive, grenade-shaped gauntlets, an explosive collar, and an orange and black motif that screamed for attention. Katsuki's crimson eyes were locked onto Izuku. The air between them practically crackled with static. Izuku didn't look back. He simply checked his HUD timer. 80 seconds until the briefing. He closed his locker. The dynamic between them had fundamentally shifted since the sludge villain incident. For 10 years, Katsuki had been the predator, and Izuku the prey. But in that alleyway, Izuku had dismantled Katsuki's superiority without throwing a single punch. Katsuki had been waiting for the UA entrance exam to prove it was a fluke, to crush Izuku on the scoreboard. But Izuku hadn't just passed. He had shattered the exam's parameters, scoring 0 villain points and a staggering 60 rescue points, placing him firmly in the top ranks. Katsuki was a pot of boiling nitroglycerin, and the lid was about to blow. Izuku knew this. He had calculated the exact trajectory of Katsuki's psychological deterioration. It was all going according to plan. Ground Beta was another sprawling faux city, though older and more industrial than the entrance exam center. The class gathered before All Might, who stood in his majestic muscle form, holding a small script in his massive hands. "The situation is this." All Might boomed, his voice echoing off the concrete buildings. "Villains have hidden a nuclear weapon in their hideout. The heroes must infiltrate and secure the weapon, or capture the villains. The villains must protect the weapon or capture the heroes. Teams and opponents will be determined by drawing lots." The drawing proceeded. Izuku watched as the names were pulled. Team A, Izuku Midoriya and Achiko Uraraka. Team D, Katsuki Bakugo and Tenya Ida. "I declare that the first battle will be..." All Might reached into the opposing boxes, pulling out 2 plastic balls. Team A versus Team D. The collective breath of the class hitched. Everyone had felt the murderous aura radiating from Bakugo whenever he looked at Midoriya. Bakugo turned his head slowly, a terrifying, feral grin stretching across his face. His palms sparked with miniature, lethal pops of light. He wasn't looking at a training exercise. He was looking at an execution. Izuku met his gaze. His own face was perfectly blank, his green eyes calculating behind the polarized lenses of his goggles. Heart rate, elevated. Posture, leaning forward, weight on the balls of his feet. He intends to disregard the objective entirely to pursue a physical altercation with me, Izuku analyzed. Predictable. Villains, go inside and prepare. Heroes, you have 5 minutes before infiltration. All Might announced, gesturing toward the towering, 5-story concrete building behind him. Bakugo stalked into the building without a word, leaving Ida to jog after him, wildly chopping his arms in an attempt to coordinate a strategy that Bakugo would undoubtedly ignore. Izuku turned to his partner. Uraraka was shifting nervously, her pink cheeks slightly pale. "Deku. Bakugo looks like he wants to literally kill you," Uraraka whispered, looking at the dark doorway of the building. His emotional instability is his primary weakness, Izuku stated calmly, tapping a button on his neck guard. He pulled a small, wireless earpiece from a pouch and handed it to her. Put this in, and listen to me very carefully, Uraraka. We are not going to fight them. We are going to break them. Uraraka took the earpiece, her eyes widening at the absolute, chilling certainty in Izuku's voice. Break them? But Ida is so fast, and Bakugo's explosions are incredibly strong. How do we bypass them? Izuku pulled up a holographic wireframe map of the building on his wrist-mounted projector. Yue had provided the blueprints. Most students merely glanced at it. Izuku had memorized it. The building is a reinforced concrete structure, 5 stories high, with a centralized stairwell and narrow, intersecting corridors. Izuku pointed to a specific room on the 5th floor. The structural integrity of this room is the highest, featuring minimal entry points and reinforced support pillars. Ida is highly rational and takes roleplay seriously. He will calculate that this room is the most defensible location for a stationary objective like a payload. The weapon is on the 5th floor, northwest corner. Uraraka blinked. You know where it is without even looking? Deduction is merely applied logic, Izuku replied. Now, onto the enemy variables. Ida Tenya. His quirk, engine, is located in his calves. It requires open, linear distance to accelerate and reach maximum velocity. He will be severely handicapped in a cluttered, enclosed environment. However, because he is a stickler for rules, he will stay behind to guard the weapon, removing all debris from the room to maximize his mobility. So he'll be alone? Uraraka asked. Yes, Izuku nodded. Because Bakugo Katsuki will abandon his post immediately. Izuku zoomed in on the 1st floor blueprint. Katsuki does not view this as a team exercise. He views it as a personal vendetta. He knows my quirk manifestation is recent. He wants to prove his superiority before I have time to master it. He will ambush us at the primary ingress point. So we go in through a window? Uraraka suggested. No, Izuku said, a cold smile forming behind his neck guard. We give him exactly what he wants. We enter through the front door. He will attack me. I will engage him. You will use the distraction to bypass him, ascend to the 5th floor via the exterior fire escape, which Ida will not monitor, as it is a dishonorable point of entry, and you will wait for my signal. Uraraka gripped her capture tape tightly. What are you going to do to Bakugo? I am going to introduce him to the concept of a variable, Izuku said softly. Synchronize your watch. Infiltration begins in exactly 60 seconds. Inside the monitoring room, the massive screens lit up, displaying dozens of camera angles from within the training building. All Might stood at the console, surrounded by Class 1A. All right, listeners. The battle begins. Now. All Might announced over the intercom. On the screen, Izuku and Uraraka walked through a 1st-floor window, stepping into the dark, echoing concrete corridor. Izuku took the lead, his footsteps completely silent, while Uraraka followed closely behind. They reached an intersecting hallway. 3, 2, 1. Izuku counted down in his head. From the shadows to their right, a blinding flash of orange light erupted. Die, DKU! Bakugo roared, lunging around the corner with terrifying speed. His right arm was pulled back, his palm aimed directly at Izuku's face, sparking with a massive, concentrated explosion. In the monitoring room, several students screamed. A surprise attack! That's cheating! Mina Ashido yelled. A surprise attack is a legitimate strategy in actual combat, Aizawa Shota's voice muttered from the back of the room, surprising the class. He was leaning against the wall, wrapped in his sleeping bag, his eyes locked entirely on Izuku. Watch the green one's feet. On the screen, Izuku did not flinch. He did not freeze in terror. He had anticipated this exact strike since he was 4 years old. Bakugo always led with a right hook. Always. It was an overcompensation of his dominant side, designed to end fights instantly with maximum concussive force. Izuku didn't step back. He stepped forward and inside Bakugo's guard. Green lightning flared violently across Izuku's body. One for all, full cal 5%. Before Bakugo's palm could fully ignite, Izuku reached up, grabbed Bakugo's right wrist, and pivoted on his heel. He didn't use OFA to punch Bakugo. He used the 5% enhancement to perfectly channel Bakugo's own immense forward momentum. Izuku twisted his hips, dragging Bakugo's arm over his shoulder, and flawlessly executed a judo throw. Bakugo was launched through the air, completely inverted. The explosion he had been charging detonated harmlessly toward the ceiling as his back slammed into the concrete floor with a bone-rattling crack. The monitoring room fell completely silent. He threw him, Kirishima whispered. Without even using his quirk to hit him. Uraraka, go, Izuku commanded instantly, not sparing a second glance at the gasping Bakugo on the floor. Uraraka nodded, turned, and bolted down the opposite corridor, heading for the fire escape exactly as planned. Bakugo coughed, all the air driven from his lungs. His red eyes widened in pure, unadulterated shock. He looked up to see Izuku standing over him, the green lightning crackling gently around his form. Izuku looked down at Bakugo. There was no anger in his eyes. There was no fear. There was only the cold, detached gaze of a scientist observing an insect in a terrarium. You always lead with a right hook, Katsuki, Izuku said, his voice flat, devoid of the stutter that had plagued his childhood. Your entire combat style is predicated on overwhelming the opponent in the first 3 seconds. But your telegraphing is atrocious. Your right shoulder dips, your breathing halts, and your center of gravity shifts entirely to your front foot. You are a one-trick pony. Bakugo's shock mutated instantly into a white-hot, blinding rage. You bastard! Bakugo screamed, scrambling to his feet, both hands igniting with massive explosions. I'll kill you! He lunged again, but Izuku was already moving. Izuku turned his back and sprinted down the dark corridor, his 5% OFA giving him incredible speed. He rounded a corner, vanishing from Bakugo's line of sight. Don't run from me, DKU! Bakugo roared, chasing after him, blasting his palms behind him to propel himself faster. The hunt had begun. Izuku navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the second floor with the precision of a ghost. The 5% physical enhancement was active, but he was using it purely for mobility, bouncing off walls, clearing gaps, and remaining completely silent. He wasn't running away. He was drawing Bakugo away from Uraraka and leading him into a highly specific environment. Izuku reached a narrow, reinforced maintenance hallway. The walls here were thicker, designed to house heavy plumbing and electrical lines. The corridor was tight, roughly 2 meters across. Izuku stopped halfway down the corridor. He looked up. In the corner of the ceiling was a small, grated speaker. The building's PA system. Izuku reached into his utility belt, pulling out a small, multi-tooled device. He leaped up, popped the grate off, and spliced a wire from his neck guard's communication array directly into the building's analog audio line. Connection established. Down the hall, Bakugo stalked through the shadows, his breathing heavy, his palms popping angrily. Where are you hiding, you damn nerd? Bakugo yelled, his voice echoing. Suddenly, Izuku's voice crackled to life, not from down the hall, but from every single speaker in the entire building simultaneously. You're breathing at approximately 130 beats per minute, Katsuki. Izuku's calm, analytical voice echoed off the concrete walls. It was chillingly detached, like a documentary narrator observing a wild animal. Your sweat production is peaking. You're frustrated because you cannot see your target. Your ego requires visual confirmation of your dominance, and right now, you are looking at empty walls. Bakugo froze, whipping his head around. Shut up. Get out here and fight me. Fight you? Izuku's voice echoed again, smooth and entirely unbothered. Why would I fight you, Katsuki? A fight implies a contest of equals. This is not a fight. This is a behavioral correction. In the monitoring room, a shiver ran through Class 1A. Is he trash-talking Bakugo over the intercom? Kaminari asked, his eyes wide. No, Todoroki Shoto spoke up, his heterochromatic eyes narrowed in deep concentration. He's not trash-talking. He's psychologically dissecting him. He's making Bakugo feel watched. He's removing Bakugo's control of the situation. On the screen, Bakugo unleashed a massive explosion at the ceiling out of pure frustration, shattering a light fixture. You just wasted 400 kilojoules of energy on a light bulb, Izuku's voice noted over the PA. Your quirk relies on nitroglycerin like sweat. Your output is finite, tied to your hydration and stamina. By angering you, I am forcing you to prematurely expend your ammunition. You are currently fighting yourself. I'll show you ammunition! Bakugo screamed, propelling himself down the hallway, turning the corner into the narrow maintenance corridor. He saw Izuku standing at the far end, perfectly still, his green eyes glowing in the dim light. Got you! Bakugo roared, raising both hands. He didn't care about the tight space. He poured everything into a massive double palm blast. A colossal wave of fire and concussive force erupted from his hands, filling the entire corridor, rushing toward Izuku like a tidal wave of death. Midoriya! Uraraka screamed in the monitoring room. He's going to be incinerated! All Might reached for the microphone to stop the match, but Izuku didn't move. He didn't try to dodge. Fluid dynamics, Katsuki, Izuku's voice whispered over the intercom, a millisecond before the flames reached him. The explosion hit the walls of the narrow, reinforced corridor. Fire and pressure expand in all directions. In an open area, the blast would disperse. But in a 2-meter-wide reinforced tube, the pressure had nowhere to go but forward and backward. The concussive wave hit the structural choke point Izuku was standing behind, a slight narrowing of the concrete walls, and rebounded violently. The backdraft was instantaneous. Bakugo, still holding his palms out, caught the full, concentrated force of his own rebounding shockwave. It hit him like a physical truck. Gawk! Bakugo choked as the air was violently sucked from his lungs, his body thrown backward into the wall. He crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath, his ears ringing with the deafening roar of his own quirk. When the smoke cleared, Izuku was still standing exactly where he had been, completely unharmed, protected by the acoustic and pressure shadow of the structural choke point he had intentionally positioned himself behind. Izuku calmly unplugged his wire from the PA system. The psychological phase was over. Now, the physical dismantling would begin. Floor 5. Northwest corner. Tenya Ida stood in the center of the room, his arms crossed, adjusting his glasses. The room was entirely empty, exactly as Izuku had predicted. The papier-mâché nuclear weapon sat in the corner. Bakugo has clearly engaged the enemy. Ida monologued to himself, adopting a deep, villainous posture. But I shall not be moved. I am the ultimate bastion of evil. Let the heroes come. Suddenly, the door slowly creaked open. Ida dropped into a combat stance, his engines revving. Aha! I am ready for you, hero. But no one walked through the door. Instead, a small, pink boot floated into the room, hovering a few inches off the ground. Then, another boot. Then, a belt. Ida blinked, completely bewildered. What trickery is this? Invisible hero? Outside the window, hanging upside down from the fire escape, Uraraka suppressed a giggle. She was in her socks. Izuku's instructions had been bizarre, but perfectly tailored to Ida's psychology. Ida is a visual and logical processor, Izuku had told her. He expects a frontal assault. If you introduce a completely nonsensical visual variable, like floating pieces of your costume, his brain will momentarily prioritize solving the puzzle over defending the objective. He will investigate the anomaly. Uraraka touched her fingertips together, releasing her quirk on the floating boots. Clatter. The boots dropped to the floor in the center of the room. Ida cautiously stepped forward, leaning over to inspect the boots. This makes no logical sense. Why would an opponent discard their footwear? Unless it's a bomb. While Ida was distracted by the boots, Uraraka slipped silently through the window behind him, moving with quiet, socks-on-concrete stealth, heading straight for the weapon. Floor 2. The maintenance corridor. Bakugo staggered to his feet. His head was spinning, blood trickling from a small cut on his forehead. The ringing in his ears was maddening. He looked down the corridor. Deku was gone. Coward! Bakugo wheezed, stumbling forward. Fight me! He rounded the corner, entering a larger, open storage room filled with concrete pillars. The moment his foot touched the ground inside the room, he felt a slight tension against his ankle. Snap! A thin, nearly invisible thread of white capture tape snapped. Izuku, crouched on the ceiling above, holding onto a pipe with 5% OFA, released the tension. A massive, heavy canvas tarp that Izuku had rigged to the ceiling plummeted downward, dropping directly onto Bakugo. Bakugo was enveloped in complete darkness, the heavy fabric tangling his limbs. "Get off me!" Bakugo roared, igniting an explosion to blow the tarp away. The tarp ripped apart in a burst of flame, but the momentary blinding was all Izuku needed. Izuku dropped from the ceiling, landing silently directly behind Bakugo. He didn't strike. He grabbed the spool of capture tape from his belt. With blinding speed, fueled by the 5% enhancement, Izuku whipped the tape around Bakugo's right wrist, pivoting, using Bakugo's blind spot, and looping the tape around Bakugo's left ankle. Bakugo spun around, swinging a wild left hook. Izuku ducked under it flawlessly, calculating the exact trajectory of the swing. He threaded the tape over Bakugo's left arm, pulled it taut behind Bakugo's back, and kicked the back of Bakugo's right knee. Bakugo's leg buckled. He fell to his knees. Before Bakugo could even process the loss of balance, Izuku pulled the tape tight, securing Bakugo's wrists together behind his back in a complex, inescapable knot. Izuku stepped back. It took exactly 3.2 seconds. Bakugo knelt on the floor, his arms bound behind him, his palms facing away from his body, rendering his explosions useless. He struggled violently, but the capture tape, designed to restrain superhuman strength, didn't yield an inch. What did you do?" Bakugo screamed, trashing like a wild animal. "Fight me! Use your damn quirk and fight me, DKU!" Izuku stood before him, breathing evenly. The green lightning faded from his body. "I did use my quirk, Katsuki," Izuku said softly, looking down at the broken, raging boy. "I used it to move into your blind spots. I used it to calculate the tension of the tape, but I didn't need to punch you. Punching you would mean engaging you on your terms. It would mean validating your belief that violence is the ultimate metric of superiority." Izuku slowly reached up and pulled down his neck guard, revealing his calm, unimpassioned face. "You lost, Katsuki," Izuku stated, delivering the final, crushing psychological blow. "Not because I was stronger than you, but because you are a fundamentally predictable equation. You played the game of a brawler. I played the game of a grandmaster." In the monitoring room, the silence was absolute. No one cheered. No one spoke. The sheer, overwhelming dominance of Midoriya's strategy had paralyzed them. He hadn't just defeated Bakugo. He had completely dismantled the boy's entire worldview, his pride, and his combat methodology without throwing a single offensive strike. He didn't even sweat, Kaminari whispered, terrified. All Might stared at the screen, his skeletal hand trembling slightly over the microphone. He had given one for all to a boy to save lives. He hadn't realized that the boy's mind was already a weapon of mass destruction. "Deku!" Uraraka's voice crackled cheerfully over Izuku's earpiece. "I secured the weapon. Ida is currently arguing with my boots." Izuku tapped his earpiece. "Excellent work, Uraraka. Mission accomplished." All Might pressed the intercom button. "Hero team." "Whyans!" All Might declared, his voice lacking its usual booming enthusiasm, replaced by a tone of profound awe. Bakugo stopped struggling. The words echoed through the storage room. "Hero team wins." He looked up at Izuku. Deku wasn't sneering. He wasn't gloating. He was already turning away, analyzing the structural damage to the walls, his mind already moving on to the next problem, the next variable. For the first time in his life, Katsuki Bakugo felt something he had never experienced before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was absolute, crushing insignificance. He was the king of Aldera Junior High. But on this board, against this player, he was just a pawn that had been manipulated into sacrificing itself. Izuku Midoriya walked out of the room, leaving the broken king kneeling in the dark. "Checkmate."